So welcome to this morning's panel on managing fraud. We have a great lineup here next to me, and there's a lot of great conversation to be had around this topic. It's unfortunately a topic that can easily cover a whole day, not just an hour. So what the panelists and I have tried to do is spend some time working through a set of questions that we think can sort of highlight some of the most interesting things that you as developers and as publishers have to think about. And then we also want to make it interactive. So we will spend the first 8 to 10 minutes going through introductions on the panel. We'll spend the bulk of the time going through a series of questions and having the panelists engage in a dialogue with you, and then spend the last 10, 15 minutes having you ask questions back of them based on the conversation. So without further ado, let me just quickly introduce the panelists, and then I'll ask each of them to speak about who they are and what they do in their role and their involvement with fraud from their company's perspective. Right next to me is Art Chu from Nexon. Next to Art is Robin Walker from Valve Software, and next to Robin is Michael Liberty from PayPal. My name is Sanjay Sarthy. I'm from a company called Vindicia. So Art, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and spend a few minutes talking about what you do.
Hello, my name is Arthur Chu. I work for Nexon America. We pioneered a free-to-play microtransaction model. I've been there for 5 years as a fraud manager, and before that I was working at a merchant acquirer in the fraud side for 2 years.
You guys don't need to speak right now. Just let us sit back.
My name is Robin Walker. I'm a programmer at Valve. I've been there 14 years now. My primary involvement, I'm on the game side of things. At Valve, we think that fraud is something that should be better. We don't have a sort of a separate fraud department. Instead, we think it's up to the game teams to think about the ways they can reduce fraud within the game design. I think it's sort of the primary place to solve a lot of these problems.
I'm Mike Liberty. I'm manager of digital goods and developer platform fraud at PayPal. Been there for about a year. My experience is kind of in risk management broadly, and it's the risk management group, I guess, at PayPal, which is a pretty large group that I'm part of.
Great, thanks. Just as context setting, just curious, how many people in the room believe they have had or have a fraud problem today? So about a third. And how many people here are developers? Game developers, actually? Okay, great. Okay, so why don't we start off by talking about when is the right time to think about fraud?
Want me to go? So, sure question. So in this industry, and I think this will tie into some of the questions we have later as well, I think about it as that you should, the kind of standard party line answer, right? Care about fraud immediately. But I think where it really becomes important is when it starts impacting your legitimate users, because that's where most profitability, that's where all your profitability is coming from. When we're talking about a low marginal cost business, that's where you should really care about it. So what I mean by that, I think there's like two primary ways that it can impact your legitimate users. One is just if you start showing up on chargeback reports, you get problems where you could actually lose status with your payment provider, and you might have problems actually processing transactions. And I think also when it actually starts impacting game mechanics, play of other legitimate players in the game, and it really can ruin your games. So there's a lot of kind of other answers I could give, but I think like that's really when you need to start thinking about it. And there's trigger points for when that'll happen, but it's a quick answer.
I think the good news is, well, I don't think you should worry too much about fraud right up, but the good news is what you should be worrying about is stuff that is to gather as much data as possible, because you'll be needing that for many other things, and that's what you need to do to be ready for fraud anyway. So at the start, don't do it so much because you're worried about fraud. Do it because you're early on. You need to understand who your customers are and what they're doing across the board, and all that data you're going to gather there will be the data you need when you start to actually have fraud problems, and you'll know when you start getting fraud problems because you're gathering all the data. So I guess in short, as Mike says, yes, worry about it up front, but do it by gathering all the stuff you need to gather anyway. So
What sort of data would you encourage people to gather?
everything and anything. I mean, yeah.
No one ever goes like back a year later, I think, on anything and says, oh, man, I really shouldn't have been collecting that data.
Yeah, it's always the opposite. Man, I wish I was gathering more. So yeah, I mean, you want to be able to, in terms of like if you're doing free to play or anything where you're selling items or you're making sales of any kind to customers, you want to know as much as possible everything about who those customers are and what they're buying and where they are and what their machines are and everything you can get about them, because that's the data you're going to need when you start having actual fraud issues.
I agree with Robin also, but I believe the video game industry is a service, and we're a service industry, and it depends on how popular your service is sometimes. Sometimes, I mean, if it involves internal game economy, if you don't have one, sometimes you might not have to worry about fraud. But if you do have some kind of trade system, whether it's your type, your industry currency like Nexon Cash, or where you can trade it off or gift it to other people, then you should worry about fraud. And if you notice that, you know, at first we didn't really have a lot of fraud 5 years ago, and all of a sudden, like in 2007, we just got hit really hard. And that was because of the popularity of our game, more people were involved, and that's when we built our fraud team. And thankfully, it was just right on time.
Think about like the characteristics of let's just talk about money generally, right? It gets kind of philosophical here, but like money has use if it's durable, portable, divisible. And the last one is like has some kind of intrinsic value, right? Someone else wants it to trade for it. So typically the tipping point, like Art said, is when your game gets popular enough that there's a secondary market that develops or something like that where, you know, someone is willing to pay for this currency as some kind of intermediate and trade with it. So when you start to see that happen, you can be sure that there's going to be fraudsters at the leading edge there, or right on people's tails, that they're gonna enter that market.
Yeah, you have a lot of control over that, obviously. One of the big switches you need to be careful about is when you allow trading of any kind of value within your system. That's the day when fraud will suddenly start going through the roof for you. So, for example, in our title, we chose to build an entire system of essentially by a persistent value without a trade system, and we did that for a year or so we could have all kinds of support in place and data gathering, so we knew everything about that system before we flipped the switch and said, okay, now customers can trade. So be aware that by changing the sort of feature set your customers have over time, you can control how much of a problem you want to create for yourself, and you can stagger that out over time so that you're ready at each step of the way.
The poker fold, right, in a poker game has been kind of the time-honored tradition of trading value for merchants. So like anyone kind of running a poker game or a gambling site or something, they kind of need to be aware of that, and it's an extension of that concept. You have kind of two parties who kind of are in cahoots with each other or something, or maybe they trade deliberately and they're both parties of the fraud, or maybe one side isn't, eventually it ends up. But when you have that trading, as Robin said, that's when you're going to start seeing.
Well, you know, as a free-to-play, microtransaction, we actually encourage trading because it helps with profitability. And say, for example, if it's part of the game mechanic and you turn it off, you're going to lose a lot of your customers.
Yeah, I wasn't advocating don't have it, so just
Yeah.
choose when you turn it on, right?
Right.
Be ready for it.
But if you have it on already and it's part of the game mechanic, you turn it off, you're going to lose a lot of people.
Yeah.
So, you can start off with not having the trade and see how it goes, and you can add it on later and see if it increases your profitability, but don't have it on and then take it off later.
And I'll emphasize too, like, this is very much just a trade-off game that you're going to be playing between customer acquisition and profitability, the next question, I think. But it's like, this isn't a moralistic value battle here, where you're simply trying to get fraud as low as you possibly can and crush it. You're really trading off what your experience for good users versus how much you need to reduce fraud.
Right. Not only will fraud hurt your processing rights, but it will also hurt your profitability, because they will always undercut you. They get it for free. So So if you're selling something for $10, they'll sell it for $5.
So actually, you bring up an interesting point around balancing fraud with customer acquisition. And so how do you, Art, at Nexon, how do you manage that balance of profitability and customer acquisition versus where your fraud levels should be at?
I mean, Michael can attest that we've done a very, very good job for the past few years, right? But what we grew our team internally and organically. So we're very, compared to other I guess, service publishers, we are very in tune with our games, our items. So our reaction time is extremely fast. We can turn something around in a day. We can have features in a day. Well, sometimes a little longer because we have to work in Korea. So that made it a little bit better for like our reaction time. And if something we noticed like certain items are being frauded, we could add a little bit more metrics in there, a little bit, turn up the heat a little bit, and it helped.
Robin, do you see the same thing at Valve, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to answer your balance question, so much as, you're always balancing a ton of work, right? You always have many more things to do than you can do, and so in a lot of cases, fraud never shows up that high on our priority list, I guess. Like, we work on it in spikes, and whenever we add a feature that our game teams are very aware of fraud because we try and connect the game teams with the fraud issues that they're creating. So, for example, the folks dedicated to doing support tickets for each game sit in the room with the dev team building the game. So they have a daily interaction around the tickets they're receiving and the issues that our customers are running into. And there's a whole bunch of tracking going on there. So if they see any kind of interesting spike or change in the types of tickets we're receiving and so on, they lean over to the developers and say, hey, I'm seeing this, did we ship something? Did we make a change somewhere? What might be causing this? And so, those conversations naturally lead into solutions of some kind. But so it's not so much a sort of a high level, this is how much time we spend on it. It's much more of a gather as much data all the time and react to what's coming. And definitely make sure your developers are really aware of the decisions they're making and how they're going to impact fraud. Right? You want to be ahead of that stuff as much as possible. So if you're going to make a change to anything in your economy, you need to think about, well, what's this mean? What's this going to do? How will fraudsters use this in some way? Arthur and I were talking just at the start. For example, to give you an idea of one of the things that what I'm talking about, the primary fraud for a little while in TF2 was customers using false credit cards to buy a desired item called a key that they were then reselling, as Arthur said, for sort of slightly less than we sell it for. So our solution to that was to simply put a short-term delay on whenever you purchase a key. There's a delay on it. You can't trade it for the first day or so, and because that's the time we need to find out if it's fraudulent, and then we can just destroy those items before they're traded off to customers, which is the point at which it becomes a real nightmare. And so by making that slight gameplay change, which is straightforward and has a minor cost to our customers, which we have to debate about, but we can measure the effect of that, right? We can essentially remove that avenue of fraud from our support desk and fraudsters options out there.
Michael, from your perspective, you obviously manage a whole portfolio of digital goods merchants. So how do you think about it from a payment provider perspective in terms of still wanting to make sure that your clients are building the revenue source that they would like, while at the same time managing fraud on the back end?
Yeah, so it's challenging for us, one, especially because, we kind of not only are managing across all digital goods, but, all physical goods merchants as well. One thing that we won't have as much visibility into that you guys will is what we talk about, like gross margin of your product. So what we tend to do, I think, is we want to be more permissive of allowing transactions to go through such that we can support your business. And then on your end, right, if there is some cost in there that we are not appreciating, then you guys it's kind of, that extra burden is to kind of put it on you, because our assumption is that a false positive, especially within digital goods, is going to cost a lot more than a transaction that makes it through, particularly if we stop it on the back end and we're able to prevent a chargeback from coming through, because that's when it really becomes painful. But that's a challenge because we're looking across the portfolio. In terms of how we measure ourselves, like there's really 4 metrics, or more than 4, but let's say like 4 key metrics that we're measuring ourselves on. We typically put it in what we call our confusion matrix, but it's catch rate, so what percentage of the fraud are we actually catching? The hit rate on transactions that we stop, and that's basically false positive ratio as well. So like what percentage of correct decisions are we making? Our decline rate, which you could say should be just a natural extension of the first 2 that I said. And then we simply just look at loss, like overall loss as a percentage of the transaction value, what manifests.
I'd like to add on Robin's comment. There are certain items in the game, it depends, I guess, on what the item is, like certain items that you can, put a delay on. Other items that are consumable, that if you did that, it's supposed to be part of the trade mechanic, and if you do that, if you put a block trade, and depending on how long, it might not sell as well. People might not just buy it, and there's a balance of probability and how much fraud you can control. If you can control it, then do it. Like Michael said, take the transaction, but if you can't, that's when you add the mechanics in and the blockage.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That perhaps goes back to our first question about how soon should you worry about fraud. You actually don't want to. You almost always want to go out with no fraud protection. This might sound a little weird, I guess, but or when we add a feature to the game where we suspect we're going to add a bunch of fraud, we're opening an avenue for fraudsters. Well, we might add extra. If we sit down and we say, man, when we do this, they're going to start doing this. The first thing we do is say, well, let's make sure we've got all the data to make sure to detect whether they're doing it and measure how much of it. And if we think we know how to shut it down, we may write the code for the feature that might shut that down, but we still won't deploy it. Instead, we go live without the feature in there because we need to measure how much fraud we're going to get. And you want to see, for example, how many of those items you're going to sell without the protection, because you want to know what's the cost of the protection. So you go live, you ship it, you measure how much fraud you're getting, you deploy maybe the feature you already had ready prior, and you see how much does fraud change and how much do the sales of the items change, because you want to make sure you're not, for example, there may not be any fraud there. You may have overestimated that, and you may now be costing yourself a bunch of money because you're selling all of that item in anticipation of an issue that actually never occurred. So wherever you can, make sure you want to create a situation where you can measure the cost. As Arthur says, there's always a cost of legitimate customers, essentially, for the addition of the anti-fraud mechanic. So you want to make sure you know how much money you're losing for the existence of that feature versus how much money you're saving for the fraud stuff.
I actually disagree with that a little bit. I mean, it depends on where your company's at. Like Nexon, we're actually to a point where we're actually hit a lot now. So it's easier to talk to the game developers, game developers, to tell them, hey, maybe this item could use like certain limit restrictions, certain level restrictions, or time restrictions built in already. Because what we noticed is some items that we were actually hit with, we can't change now. Because we tried that one time and we lost like 30% of our revenue for that item, and we had to put it back to normal. Like I said, if it's part of the game mechanic and you touch it, it changes the mechanic, people will stop buying it. And your upper management will be like, well, what just happened here? Or, we lost 30% of our sales for 2 weeks. And we're like, well, it was being frauded, but we had to change some metrics, and we might have to just put it back. And like I said, we're just taking it now because we didn't put it in initially.
I think the point about doing control group analysis basically is what Robin was talking about, is a good one. Something we do constantly at PayPal. You shouldn't have a control in place, and I would argue any control, but it obviously exists in the spectrum, that you never revisit, right? Because, this is just standard and we always can handle that. there will be some that approach that, but you should reevaluate them constantly to see if they're actually having a negative impact on your business, and see what kind of fraud gets through. And you really have that luxury as a digital goods merchant. I said luxury. There are some industries where you simply can't do that, because if you ship these goods, you've lost a major cost because of what you paid for that. So take that opportunity, do that kind of analysis.
Let me add one more thing. Just think about an item or some product that you have. If you find a way, if you think of an idea to exploit it, it's going to be done. It's just the honest truth.
Yeah,
They'll do it.
Fraudsters are very entrepreneurial.
Yeah, super creative.
Yeah, they're, like I was telling him, there's like a, there's a statistic that, 1 out of 1,000, there's one genius born, and we are way outnumbered. There's 3 billion over there and what, a few hundred million here. Yeah, they're very creative.
So let's say now, taking Art's argument to the next stage, you are hit with an attack, a fraudulent attack. What would be your recommendation, based obviously on the type of attack, in terms of what would you do next to your game, your studio's been hit with an attack, what next?
So what we do is we do post-analytics. We see we collect all the data, everything, from the items, IP, the level that purchased it, how long the account's been around. We collect all the data, and what we do is we see what a certain percentage of where that fraud's coming from. So for example, accounts are usually created less than a week. 50% of our fraud happens around that time. So what we can do is at that point, maybe we can add it so if an account is below a week, they can't purchase that item. So we can distribute metrics like that, and it won't impact like the revenue a lot, because usually most people, free to play, we want some type of game investment, some sort of use of our service before they actually pay, and it's just a given. You don't just come in and just go, oh, I'm going to drop $100 the minute you log in. That usually doesn't happen. So some certain metrics like that, it's actually okay to have.
Robin?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I don't really know how to answer the question in abstract, I guess, because it would depend. We would look at the data and find out what's going on and take measures appropriately. There's no. I guess we don't have a single sort of solution that we apply to all. Sometimes we might need to make a change, as says, to who can buy it, or when they can buy it, or how they buy it, or maybe we need to make a change to our game design so to make that less interesting to them, or whatever. It's hard to. We would just sit down as a group, and
Right.
be folks from our support group there, and folks from Steam, and folks from us, and we'd look at our data and try to figure out what's the right thing to do.
But as a publisher, it's a little bit difficult. We have about 7 different games and 7 different developers. And each one is, I guess, pulling teeth sometimes. You got to make these changes. You're like, no, it doesn't work like that. Or we can't do it. Or Korea doesn't have this problem. And I'm like, well, you're not in Korea, and here's our metrics. Please take a look at it. And sometimes, it's you don't get the help that you need, because they're different publishers. We're paying them royalties, and sometimes depending on how popular the game is, they become a little bit more difficult to work with. They become like almost prima donna. Like, we're making so much money, this is just, we don't have to make changes for you, right? But then after a while, we start, we start doing internal tune downs, and they realize, well, why is our revenue dropping? Because you're not making changes, and we have to make it our own. And that's when they start listening a little bit. It's all about the money.
So first thing I would say, if you're hit with attack, don't totally freak out. This is unfortunately part of the digital goods, virtual goods industry. It happens, and the biggest players in the industry have been hit with it. In fact, a lot of times they're the hardest hit. So you're probably hitting some level of success if you get if you start to get hit. I can tell you some things not to do. Don't go out and just buy a tool of some kind. Like, oh, I'm getting hit, I've got to go find a tool that'll fix it for me. that's kind of like going out and buying the greatest pair of golf clubs when you're just still a terrible golfer. Tiger Woods is still going to beat you any day with a terrible pair of golf clubs. So the people who are most successful at it are the ones who can sit down, review cases, right? Try to figure out the story that is involved here. What did the fraudster do? How did they exploit my game? And then go back and try to build in. A lot of times it's homegrown controls that just start out focusing on stopping the chargeback from happening, right? And then you get more and more sophisticated. The chargeback is really when it's going to start hurting your business because you get hit with a fee. And again, if you get over a certain level, then you can really start to run into some pain from payment providers. Reaching out to your payment provider too can be a positive thing. If you start to see a problem, letting them know how you're going to get it under control can be very helpful.
Actually, if your chargeback's over like 2% the first month, you should start worrying.
Yeah.
Because it's a snowball effect. It takes about 3 to 4 months for actual chargeback. So this has been happening a few months back. So if you start seeing it 2%, you only have 2 more months to fix that. So you should totally panic a little at that point. If it's just like 1%, then maybe you can do something about it. But if it's like over 2%, you should totally panic.
Yeah.
And just to echo on Art's point there, just when he's talking about percentages, for those of you who aren't aware, there's actual restrictions in terms of what percentage of your total transactions can be charged back.
It's based on revenue times divided by your chargeback.
Right.
So
So,
transaction count or the actual dollar value.
Right, but it depends. I think your transaction count doesn't apply if you're like a high grossing merchant, like not in transaction wise. If you're doing like 5,000 transactions a day, they're not going to penalize you for 100 chargebacks, right? But if it's it's 2 parts, right? It's 2 parts. So you're given a certain leeway if you have a lot of transactions, but if you hit that transaction plus the dollar, that's when you have to worry.
so we've talked about fraud sort of in sort of the monolithic sense, right? And in reality, there are different types of fraud. You have organized fraud where you have card rings and people card testing and doing things like that. And then you have this concept of friendly fraud where it's Sanjay going out and deciding that he didn't really want to pay for that item and charging it back. If you take the friendly fraud item, or the friendly fraud side of the sort of fraud business, how do you stop people from coming back? What are some of the tips and techniques you can share in terms of identifying and then potentially stopping friendly fraud from occurring on a consistent basis?
Well, you have to be very careful on how you control your friendly fraud, because most of these times, friendly fraudsters are legitimate customers that just went bad. So if your metric is too strong, you're actually blocking legitimate customers. Now, what we did was we added like a device identification. So we added device identification. So basically, it identifies your device as like a fingerprint. So most of the time, there's the control in a control environment. Like the legitimate users don't know how to bypass this technology. The organized fraudsters maybe, but most of the legitimate ones, like just your average Joe, they're not that tech savvy. They just it's hard for them to come back. That's what we did. And we try to be a little bit careful because we don't share information, but we share that device ID with other merchants. So if we claim it as chargeback, they might not be able to log in certain other merchants. So we make sure they did.
How do you share that information? with other merchants?
It's the service that we use.
Okay.
They have other merchants under their contract, and we just basically, it's a reputation thing.
I would say, particularly depending on the demographic that you are targeting, have generous refund policies. If you're gonna make a game that's targeted at kids, and it's a mobile, game.
Actually, yeah.
Kids are gonna get a hold of their parents' phones. They're gonna play around. They're just gonna charge up a whole bunch of money. Again, like have a generous refund policy. You're gonna be much better off returning those funds, kind of recognizing that this is something new that parents and kids are dealing with in every other retail situation that people deal with. They're kind of used to this idea that they can return whatever has been purchased and get their funds back. Whereas, you might, digital goods, that's not really a concept per se or not, but people are going to be able to expect that. So they should be able to expect that. Work with them, it'll save you a lot of pain, that you won't show up on chargeback reports, which will do more harm to your business than fighting kind of a moral battle against these situations.
And you won't end up with stories on newspapers about how you money from kids and so on.
Yeah.
Let's not point fingers.
But it's hit, the biggest, again, it's everyone, so.
So let me add to Michael's point. Mobile payment is actually one of our highest frauded payment system right now. Everything else, got under control, but mobile payments mostly. We had one guy use like 5 phone numbers, and it was a family plan, and came back as fraud, friendly fraud, not organized fraud. Some kid just went crazy with his parents' phones.
Maybe you just refund the money to the parents?
Well, here's the thing, we don't even have to do the refund. They call the carrier and it happens. They just call like whatever carrier they have and they said it, but the guy did it 3 times in a row.
Oh, really?
So he charged it, called his carrier, got his money back, charged again with his 5 phone numbers, called the carrier, got his money back, and charged again. And
So his interaction was just with the carrier, not with Nexon, not with you?
So what happened was the carrier didn't tell us until like, I guess the billing cycle was over,
Okay,
which was like 28 days, 30 days.
Right.
So we didn't find out until it was already paid, but it was done
just done.
3 times.
Just 30 days.
So that's a point, there's going to be different resolution procedures depending on the payment method that you're taking. I'll plug PayPal briefly, and just that, we have a dispute resolution center, and I think that actually goes a long way to help digital goods merchants, because a lot of that stuff gets either resolved by our agents who are reviewing transactions, or in the resolution center, in which case it doesn't show up as a chargeback, so you don't have those kinds of problems. Whereas like with carriers, it's a tougher situation.
Right, you
to
don't have a
deal
lot
with
of
that.
control.
Yeah. I actually think digital goods merchants are in pretty even footing if the dispute is going through the PayPal resolution center with buyers, but that's not the case with all.
In addition to...
Can I add one thing on to
Yes,
that?
please.
Sorry. We found it useful in a couple of places to detect to actually be sort of proactive, where we detect someone spending a lot more than we would expect, and actually call that person, or have some step we take where we just say, just want to make sure that that you're really meaning to do this, essentially, because in some cases, it's a kid who's got their parents' credit card or something. And if you do that right, it can be received by legitimate customers as this really positive thing that you're looking after them, and you can cut down on that sort of stuff before it gets to chargebacks and so on. And there's issues of scale there and all that sort of stuff you need to be careful about. But the point is if you are getting friendly fraud's another thing you can look at is the place where it really hurts you is when it starts getting to chargebacks or something, right? Those people are going to get their money back from their credit card. So you may as well try and make sure you do it in a way that doesn't cost you, it doesn't hurt you, and it's sort of considered as a service by your customers.
Right, you get a certain amount of budget, I guess, that you can work with, but like for our free-to-play, we just couldn't, we can't do that proactive action. We can't have a call center calling you, because sometimes we actually do have people that spend $2,000 a month on a regular basis, and if you kept calling them, they might consider that they shouldn't be spending $2,000 a month.
Yes. Yeah, I don't mean to imply that's exactly what we do. I mean, you'll have a ton of data before you make any, hopefully you have a ton of data before you make any decision like that, and you can know exactly how many customers you're going to impact and the costs it will be to you. And you need to make good decisions. So yeah, you're not calling the people who are spending the most money, because in any free-to-play environment, they're the ones generating a huge amount of your money.
I mean, I think if you're a company that's cares a lot about analytics, right? I mean, the skills are pretty complementary. Like if you're talking about marketing analytics, these kinds of things that are just part of web and game analytics 2.0 or whatever you want to call it. It actually transitions to fraud stuff as well. So if you see a major deviation from typical patterns, right? I mean, first-time buyer just spent X $1,000,
Right.
you know, you should set up a flag.
Yeah, you should set up a flag for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like I said, if somebody's been in your game environment for only like less than a month and they're spending like 2-3K, you should definitely look at that. Yeah.
I'm curious what you could spend $2,000 on in a month. Just-
Actually, you'd be surprised. We have a lot of
Like,
items
I'm
that
just thinking
are.
of the Valve pack. Like, if I bought everything Valve had for sale, could I, like in TF2, could I hit that much money?
You can buy an infinite number of keys a month.
All right.
We have
Buy
items
a
that
lot
are
of keys.
yeah, $10 a pop. People buy like thousands of them.
The word micro at the start of microtransactions is kind of misleading
It's
everyone.
like a consumable item sometimes, and they use it, and that's the thing. That's the item I was telling you about. You can't put a trade block on it, because the minute we did that, it screwed up sales.
Well, and free-to-play type games too. I mean,
Right.
most like the economics is skewed towards
Right.
those folks. You've got so much of the population who's not spending anything, and then you've got.
But the funny thing is, we have a game called Combat Arms. It's a free-to-play first-person shooter, and most of our friendly fraud comes from that game. And it doesn't have a game economy. It doesn't have anything. But the demographic that it services is around 18 to 26. So people new with credit cards, and they know the system.
Dealing with friendly fraud and dealing with like organized fraud, very different.
Very different.
Very, very different.
Actually, on that point, can you maybe talk a little bit, we talked about friendly fraud, we switched tacks a little bit to talking about organized fraud. What are some of the differences in terms of either attacking it, looking at it, that people need to take? Maybe we'll start with you, Michael, and then work our way this one.
So organized fraud, I actually think it comes down to more of a forensic / technological challenge, right? I mean, you go back, you kind of, it's all about pattern recognition around machines, communication, these kinds of things, telling the story of how a fraudster got into the system. Maybe you're not always going to have visibility on how they acquired the credentials, if you're talking about like an account takeover, or how they acquired the fraudulent credit card information, the stolen credit card information, but you can kind of generally see a pattern of where they're coming from, what they're doing in the game, and how they execute them. Friendly fraud, like those techniques aren't really work because it's all going to look, it's going to look legitimate, basically up until something goes wrong. And so then it's more about just understanding like what typical purchasing patterns are for a legitimate player who's not going to file a chargeback later. So it's different, but it's much more of a technological, I would say, challenge with organized fraud. What do you guys think about
Yeah,
that?
I'll add to that. I mean, forensics is a pretty good description for it. It's the place where you're going to need the most data, and you're going to need tools that allow your support people to get through that data as effectively and quickly as possible, right? They need to be able to, they should, as they're just looking at someone's account, an individual, I'm concerned about the fraud, I think this person's involved in fraud, they need to be hit with all, the tool needs to really help them understand, wait a minute, this is the same computer that's using these other 18 accounts, and wait a minute, this person here is one we've investigated 3 times before, and all those this is the bit where you need all that data, and it needs to be rapidly accessible, because these are the ones that take the most time to investigate and find. This is the place where thinking about how does someone make the what's the easiest way to make real money off our system is going to be the places where you'll find a lot of this, you'll find where these guys are going, all that sort of stuff.
I'll add to that. Like, if you start suspecting that you're getting hit by organized fraud, that's when you should start shopping around for tools. Your developers probably can't do everything. We tried that on our own, and it wasn't successful. We had to actually go shop around for some tools, which actually helped.
Yeah, I would say like people first, tools second. Focus on getting some right people organized. People kind of have a mindset of thinking about how you can exploit these games, and then you'll be much better equipped to evaluate these tools and how you might use them. The other thing I would say is, this probably sounds a little overwhelming, like in terms of the amount of time that it can take to do this, and I'll agree with that. So I will say, particularly in your early days as a developer, I messing around with doing any kind of direct credit card processing. Get a payment provider who at least provides some incremental fraud protection. I obviously have a bias here, but in those early days, we want to be focused on doing everything you can to make your game successful. At some point, you will need to focus on fraud, but you should do what you can to give you that minimal amount of protection to start. And with some providers, you're going to get pretty sophisticated systems.
I think organized fraud is a place where fundamentally the people there are trying to make money by exploiting your system. That's what they're trying to do. And so that's the sort of place where making sure that you can get huge value out of changing your game design and changing the things that customers value in your product. Those are the places where you don't want to be in a situation where your dev team is happily doing whatever the heck they want and ignoring the cost of their decisions in terms of fraud and saying that's the fraud guy's problem to deal with, right? That's a separate problem. Like the dev team needs to be aware, no, that's part of the cost of their decisions. They need to be thinking about it because they can, in one fell swoop, make a change that can destroy whole avenues of fraud without having to go into the nightmare of actually investigating. They can just remove the ability to make profit in that space instantly with a single decision, and that will shut down organized fraud in most of these cases. So, one thing to think about.
Right, and also like their reported earning for the end of 2010 was about $10 billion. So they're making more money than we are.
So what, I'd like to open it up just, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying we should get in fraud.
Oh, that's my retirement plan.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm good enough.
Post-development. Before I open it up for questions from the audience, are there any recent trends that are happening on the fraud side, whether by organized or?
I think we all agree on one thing, right? Account takeovers?
Innovation.
Yeah, account takeovers are by far the.
So can you describe that maybe just in terms of how it's seen and
Go
what
ahead,
people do
payment side,
about
I'll
it?
tell you.
Yeah, so I would just say like innovation in general, they're getting better and better and better. So like malware, botnets, all these like new ways of kind of acquiring credentials and information that you want. It's an arms race on both sides. So you're often in the situation that it's kind of it's whack-a-mole, right? I mean, you never ever are going to push this down to take care of it here. It's going to pop up again elsewhere. You don't want to end up in the cycle, but it's going to be challenging not to. And if you are worst equipped a kid in the group, then you're going to get picked on.
Right. We've also noticed that account takeovers has evolved very much within the past couple of years, where they're actually being selected now on the account that they've taken over. So before they used to use all the accounts that were compromised. Now they actually check the accounts to see if it has any value, and they won't use it if it has no value. So they've evolved a lot.
So we've got some time for questions from the audience.
Actually, I wanted to add one more thing.
Yeah.
Well, I heard this, I was reading this up, but it was funny, like, when the banks first created the first ATM, they brought in all the specialists and, security fraud and everything like that, and they've been working on it for a year, and, they released the first ATM. So they're thinking, wow, you should be safe. Took 4 guys in a truck and they took their ATM. So, I mean, I'm just saying, sometimes whatever you're thinking about, it just takes something really simple to break your tools.
Yes.
It sounds like you've been talking mainly about direct financial fraud, but for me, the most insidious kind of fraud has always started with cheating on gameplay.
Oh, you mean like hacking?
Or something where you're supposed to be doing it yourself, or having
Botting and
access
hacking.
yourself, or
Right.
computers.
It's not going to stop.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
But, well, how much effort, and that's something that really needs to start at the beginning of creating the game.
Right, but
Figuring out
right,
how
right.
somebody might cheat and monitoring it.
Right, I mean,
How much effort do you two on the publishing side put into that aspect?
We spend a lot of time thinking about that. We probably spend more time thinking about that than financial fraud.
Right.
But and that one's a little different. When people are cheating, they're essentially trying to get status. Well, there's two things. They're either trying to get status or trying to earn value. In our system, we have deliberately chosen that there's no way they can cheat to earn value faster than someone who's not cheating, because we do everything just based on time played. They can cheat by playing more, by not playing, but they don't earn more than anyone who's just happens to be playing that time as well. So they can't use a bot or an aimbot to earn value faster than someone else, and that was one of the choices made deliberately because of this reason. In terms of status, one of the advantages is they can't, if you're back in the old days with Counter-Strike, for example, status was your position on the scoreboard, right? It was localized how good you were. That's a cheatable thing. Now, status is essentially, what hat are you wearing? Right? It's what persistent value you required, and you can't bot that essentially. So by changing what customers value, you can also make a large impact on whether or not cheating is a really viable thing. One piece of data: our games that have persistent value around them, where there's a bigger cost to losing the account if you're caught by automated systems, and the value is in these other things, have far and away lower amounts of cheating than our games that have, than games like Counter-Strike or something, which have a much sort of purer. It's purely just status, right? Skill.
I envy him, because we actually have a different situation where you can level up and you can rank up, and it can be done within, depending on the hack or bot, you could do it in a week where it normally takes somebody a year. So I guess it depends on the hack. Sometimes what we try to do is we try to educate our players, because we do have very young children that play, and sometimes they just don't know any better. But it really depends on the hack. If they've been botting or cheating and they've been doing something that can interfere with the whole mechanic of the game, say for example, they leveled up to what it would normally take a year and they did it in a week, we would have no choice but to close that account. And we do have metrics that tells us like I said, how old is this account? Why is it level 100 when it shouldn't be? And we base that and we just close those accounts. But if it's just something like a minor, just a minor hack, where it's just like, okay, it just progressed you just a little bit faster, then what we do is we give them a warning. We tend to ban them for like a week or two, kind of make up for the time that they progressed, and we tell them, hey, we can't do this again. This is your last chance. And that's it.
I guess I should say I've been doing online chess where there's a feeling in the community that there's widespread cheating and no one wants to play there anymore.
Right. I guess it depends on like I said, it depends on the type of bot and hack. There are certain things that you should not tolerate at all. I mean, no second chances. But there are certain ones where it might not be as bad, and you can make up for it by, closing that account for a limited time, and it makes up for the difference that they did.
It's worth noting what you said there is the truth of it. It's a perception problem you're fighting almost more than a reality problem. The community will generally perceive there being a much bigger problem than there actually is, and and that's an opportunity for you, right? You can fight the perception sometimes better than you can fight the reality.
And in fact, if we cracked down too hard and gotten more cheaters,
it might be that you need to promote the catches you make, for example. Yeah. And I think this is a really good example of what I was talking about before. I recognize your game design is one of the biggest tools you have for how much you control so many of these things. And so picking a choice that can, making changes to your game design is a really good way to address some of this. Another point to make, the problem is we've trained our users and trained, if you're going to, we've mentioned arms race a few times, it's important to think about, is the solution we're putting in place right now to the problem we have today just creating an arms race? Are we going to have to keep working on this for the rest of our lives? That's a sucky decision to have to make, especially when, if you're coming out with a new game now, you'll be getting hacked by the guys who have spent the last 20 years hacking our games, and they're super trained at this point. They have fantastic tools. They're deep inside the Windows kernels. They're incredibly powerful, and you don't want to have to. That's an arms race you don't want to get in. We don't want to be in it, and you certainly don't want to be starting in it. That's a terrible place to start it.
Other questions? Yes.
So we talked about tools. Can you mention names of tools that work for some of you?
Are we allowed to?
Sure.
I think you should talk.
I can, but it won't be as informative. So, like, most of our stuff is homegrown, so, yeah. I don't know what to say on that. I mean, I know of vendors, but I'm not gonna
Well,
endorse it.
you're, oh, okay. Well,
Maybe you can talk about the types of tools.
we use
categories,
geolocation.
and then-
Sorry?
We use a geolocation tool,
Yeah.
and I think we use the same one.
Yeah, I think like in terms of just simply getting the geolocation of
Right.
IP addresses.
And then we also, as I mentioned previously, we also use a device ID tool. So, you know, if you want to know vendors, I would have to tell you offline.
So, for your fraud decisions, are those all handmade? How much percentage of your fraud decisions are programmatically made rather than handmade? So you have an actual guy saying, this is obviously fraud, this is what we're going to do about it, versus a program saying, this looks like fraud, we're going to terminate the account then.
Program doesn't work.
So the program doesn't work,
Yeah.
so it all has to be
They'll,
handmade.
we tried that one time. We built the program. We did it, you know, based on metrics. It took us 3 months to develop it, launch it, test it, launch it. They broke it in 2 weeks. So I'm that guy.
So you're that guy?
Yeah.
So we have a mix of that. Whenever we make any decision, our goal is to ask, how do we never have to do this again? We try to scale as much as possible, code scales. So we haven't, I agree with Arthur, like we don't have automatic systems that close accounts, but we have tons and tons of automatic systems that measure and fight and flag, this looks suspicious, and someone needs to look at this, and there are people who come into work and sift through, and I'm sure you have exactly the same, sift through, you know, the various computer-generated flags that have been.
Yeah, let me add that. Flag.
Yeah,
Don't, don't close.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so at the end of the day, we realize, especially the hard investigation stuff. But that said, for our cheating detection, for example, we have a huge amount of automated systems there that do all that. That's automated compute. Humans actually aren't involved in the decisions around who should get banned for various cheats. That's something very programmatic. But I mean, as a philosophy, I think you should adopt wherever you can, try and get humans out of every decision you can stomach. I agree with that. Closing accounts is one I don't think you should stomach, but because you want to, that's how you don't want to scale your support staff like your customer scale. That would be terrible.
We do quite a bit of stuff automatically, so like we separate our system into our front end models, which there's a lot of front end models running, whether it's CC funded, ACH funded, whether we're trying to detect an account takeover versus back end stuff versus actual agent review. The thing we really try to focus on the front end stuff is the customer should have a way out. So you're never going to be perfect on your decisions, and we try to avoid outright declines if we can. So, for instance, like account takeover type situations, we throw challenge questions, right? If it's kind of in a gray area, so you provide that extra amount, the customer can provide that extra amount of information. We don't want to just decline outright and kill the transaction. We're never going to, we may restrict accounts automatically, but there's always that way out. But again, we try to, the harsher the action, we try to make, get people involved more.
The same goes for support tickets. So, we're looking at support tickets that are coming in every week, and we're saying, what class, can we programmatically remove this entire class of tickets? So things, building features like Steam Guard and so on are about how to, our number one, right now we're dealing with lots of tickets to do with customers just getting their accounts back after they're stolen. How can we make it so customers can just get their account back? Right now we're working on a system for, I just got scammed in a trade. How can I resolve that account, that trade scam, without having to contact support? Right. So running that, which always, in the end they always end up writing code. But again, it's I think part of the same philosophy. How do we use code to solve as much as we possibly can?
Doing it automatically is wicked hard. It's really hard. And the only reason we can is because it scales, right? We kind of need that scale, and so you have statisticians, that's all they're doing is building models to do that. And you always always going to lead the customer the way out, because no model's going to be perfect. So.
Right, like I said, you have to be very careful when you deny transactions. So flagging is always the best option. And if there's something you can do after you realize there's all these flags and 90% of the flag is fraud, or then maybe you can do something at that point. But usually what happens is they're very, like I said, everybody agrees they're very, very creative, and they're able to find a system. Before, IPs were reliable, no longer. Geolocation was very reliable because your credit card always matched your general location. It's not that reliable now. So everything, you should be very careful. Like, what we can do is we can flag the dollar amount. So if somebody came in fraudsters are very greedy. If you let them charge 1,000, they will do it. And so what we do is sometimes we have a spending cap, and generally 99% of the time they hit the spending cap.
There's a subtle point there in what you just said, which is useful. Sometimes you have metrics or you have data that is useful to you that if you use it to police, they will immediately work around, and it's better to not use it for police and just use it for the data gathering. Right? So sometimes you can, knowing what percentage, using the, especially when you get into the forensics or something, right? Sometimes there's data that that if you actually started using that in any way, they'd immediately work around it, but because you haven't, they don't bother, and it's useful for you to just for that data.
Hard limits they tend just not to work.
Right.
It'll be a matter of hours before they adjust.
2 weeks.
Right? Huh?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. Well, see, as quick as a matter of hours before they have adjusted the number down. If you're simply putting a transaction cap on, bring it down, put up a bunch, so you can need to, if you're keeping track of aggregates, these kind of things.
Great. I think we have time for one more question for the break. Else?
I'll continue.
Okay.
To continue on with that question, especially in your case, do you have a fluid staff that grows and shrinks with the games that you offer and the shipments that you make? Let's say that you're going to offer a whole new game or a whole new system to a game that you're thinking that may incur fraud, friendly or otherwise. Do you shrink and grow staff to meet that? Do you outsource that? Do you?
No.
How do you?
Like I said,
control
our fraud team has grown organically. We built it in all the internal. So all our fraud is based, decision is based by me or my team, and that's why we have a very quick reaction, because we're very in tune with the items. So what happens is basically right now, if we have a new game that's being published, we're already doing fraud metrics for it. So it's not even in beta yet, but we have a list of items that's coming in, and we're deciding can this item be exploited? Can this be item if we make any changes? Will we lose profit? What does this item do? And we're very we're very advanced in that method right now, and I think it's also building a level of trust. Your upper management has to trust you as a team, that you're not trying to cut them off for profit. You actually have a purpose, your decision, and it makes sense. And they might not understand it because they're about making a profit. When you tell them, well, maybe we shouldn't sell 1,000 of these, or let people buy 1,000 of these because it doesn't make any sense, right? But if you put it in that perspective, then maybe they'll listen to you. Maybe we should have a cap at 1,000 or something. But there has to be a level of trust. I think trust is very important in your team. If you don't trust your fraud team, then you might as well just go to a third party.
So you handpick each member and make sure that he fits in.
I train each member.
And then they grow into their responsibilities.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, each person has their own side game, and but we all do the analytics together. Say certain games, depending on season, get attacked a little bit more than others. So we pull our resources together and kind of do a think tank and decide, well, what just happened, do post analytics, and see if there's anything we can do to do damage control immediately. If not, then what we can do is just take it and probably just take it and mitigate it with refunds.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Art, Robin, and Michael for the session today.